What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Normally, I start these videos with the most influential / best deck in the game, but I think it's important to give some context to this one, which is one of several decks utilizing a similar core. Zabu, and of course Shang-Chi, and Enchantress, and Gwenpool, and Galacta, and Surge, and in varying amounts, you're going to see these cards show up across the first section of this video, because what I'm doing is I'm going to cover the decks like this. And I think that that is an important thing to grasp, is that this is an entire sector of the metagame. Each of them has different strategies for getting points and interacting in certain ways, but all of them exist in this same space. They are decks that are Sera-less Sera, or some of them even play Sera, and decks that are looking to do efficient stats paired with good interaction, a classic Marvel Snap strategy. This one comes from Shamo. It is a very reasonable deck. If you had to pick one legitimate deck out of any deck in the game, this is a very fine choice. You will go the absolute least wrong with a deck choice like this. There is almost nothing that is going to be actively bad about your choices when you pick a deck like this. Now, there are going to be decks that are going to be trying to attack decks like this in different ways, but the diversity of decks within this space means that there are going to be different tech cards that are relevant in different matchups. For example, someone might attack you by playing Mr. Negative and trying to go over the top of you, but you have a Mobius in this one. Not all of the decks like this will, but enough of them will that it makes these decks hard to target, which is why they're at the top of this list. Almost the exact same thing is going on here. This is the same core of cards utilizing a different point output mechanism. In this case, they've swapped the Fenris Wolf package for a Werewolf by Night package. It doesn't even change species, we're just changing wolves. And so this is again a deck that has similar fair matchups across the board. You are relying on tech and discounts, and then you are using the efficient stats that you have access to in order to make up the difference in those lanes. A very, very solid deck. Very impossible to go wrong in this archetype. I will admit I am a little proud of this one. This is the Elektra value deck that I posted a video on 2 days ago, and since then, this exact 12 cards is sitting with almost a 60% win rate in top 10% Infinite on Untapped right now, with about 230 games. I consider that a great achievement, honestly, but it also just goes to show just how little it actually matters what these decks are specifically doing beyond the tech pile stuff. Like, this is just a different way of getting points on the board. Instead of doing all of the Galacta, Gwen, and Wolf stuff, you're doing some Mysterio stuff that goes with your Sasquatch, right? Like, it's just differences in the efficient point package part of the deck. All of these decks are points plus interaction. All the interaction is the same across all of them. What's different is where the points come from. And I think in light of that, as proud as I am of getting an Elektra deck to a 60% win rate, that's awesome. She actually is pretty good. Like, she's just like a 1-6 a lot of the time. It's not the worst thing in the world. It really isn't. I don't think she's like amazing in meta or anything, but in a game where people are playing a lot of like Zabus and Hoods and stuff, it's like, oh, you know, she's like a 1-2 to 1-4. Maybe you get a demon with it. She gets some bigger stuff there. Just kind of solid, honestly. Technically, the least like this of these decks is Invisisera, which is actually my preferred option right now, largely because of the priority games I get to play with Invisible Woman. I consider Invisible Woman a fairly high skill cap card, and I like that it allows a deck like this to have positive matchups, or at least outs, into decks like Move Bounce, Normal Bounce, and even sometimes the Nimrod piles by virtue of delaying our cards long enough in those matchups. It's most prominent in the bounce matchups because those are the ones that are going to be actually able to throw priority, but being able to delay your cards and guarantee that they are happening after your opponent's cards is very valuable. And the fact that this is a card that can do that on the final turn of the game. I know people are going to be like, why not play Ghost? It's got better numbers on it. Ghost can't do it on the final turn of the game. An Invisible Woman can, and that actually does matter. Again, this is the sort of high skill cap version of this deck, but I found it to be very powerful. Of course, I'm not going to sit here and act like it's not just another one of the Shang and Gwen Surge decks. It absolutely is. The next sector of the metagame I want to talk about is the stuff these decks are preying on. While they typically have decent matchups across the board, these are decks that are sort of existing to do specific things. And there are two decks that these decks are particularly good against in my experience, and those are Nightmare and 34-card Monte. And the reason for that is that these are decks full of answers and power, and the Nightmare and 34-card Monte lists are presenting threats. So if those threats get answered in a valuable way, i.e., if you play a big guy, that cost you 6 energy, I Shang-Chi it, that only cost me 4, trading up pretty consistently, that leaves a lot to be desired from, unfortunately, Nightmare and 34-card Monte. Nightmare, I think, is the better of the two. This is a deck that is all about asking questions. It does so in a fun way. You have to maximize the surprise value you get, but you can do some really cool stuff with this deck. It is a real deck. It is pretty damn good. But don't sit here and act like you are invincible just because you played some big guys. Every single person you're going to play against, you have to be aware of a Shang, and you need to be prepared to get Shang. There is powerful stuff to be done with this shell in other sort of cores. I've seen various very interesting Infinite Nightmare decks that are cool, but I think ultimately less consistent than what this deck is outputting. That said, Nightmare is a viable strategy. It's just one that is awkwardly placed in the metagame. A few weeks ago, I remember saying that 34-card Monte would start dying out basically as decks got better and more refined. And that is what is happening right now, more or less. Decks are getting better and more refined, and frankly, I don't think this is a good choice of deck. There are going to be certain types of people that really love playing it, but I don't think you have a lot of good matchups left, especially since you don't even necessarily beat Nightmare decks anymore. Since so many of them are just basically Sauron decks, which is a really bad matchup for you because they just stat you to death, and they have this potential additional upside, you end up with a vast group of poor matchups. Now, you're Arishem. You don't really have a matchup chart the same way other decks do, but it is still not the greatest thing in the world to look out at a sea of decks that are more highly refined than they were in week 1 of this metagame. And believe me, they are. This is almost in that opening section. Like, I think it might be a little bit cheating to not put this in the opening section, because, like, look, dude, it's like, we got the Merlin, we got the Surge, we got the Ench, we got the Shang, we got the Zabu. It's kind of one of those decks too, but it's also a deck that just has a very good anti-mid-range points package. The only thing that makes me really not love how this deck exists right now is that there's just so much Merlin running around that it starts to feel like it's basically pointless to even send over your stuff to your opponents. Like, I almost always would prefer polymorphing the Void at this point, just because it's so plausible that they are going to have their own Merlin and polymorph it, and you're just going to feel like an idiot. And I think that that is evidence, I would say, of this deck being a bit of an awkward spot because of all the Merlin, which is definitely part of the good cards piles. So I don't think it's a surprise that the version of this that I like is the one that is the closest to the good cards pile version. It's not shocking to me. This looks like a vastly different deck, but it's really not far off from the Spawn of Yakub deck that we talked about in the second slot in this video. My preferred build of Thanos at the moment is still the Thanos 10s deck, which I think is just really good at doing numbers. It is also notably of the decks that are able to be Surtur decks. A lot of people are playing Nightmare right now. This is the one that is actually able to play good interactive cards against the sea of Shang-Chi, like Armor and Cosmo, and I think that goes a really long way towards why I like it right now. This is a deck that interacts with the interaction. I see the interaction as a very imminent threat to playing big guys, so interacting with the interaction is to me a bit of a prerequisite for a deck to really hit that elite level. I think this is a really underrated deck. I really do. I don't know if it's going to catch on, but this is definitely something that I have kept in my back pocket and I strongly suspect is legitimately very strong right now. It's weird, but I haven't actually found a better shell for Cannonball Mercury than the day one version that I hit rank 1 with a couple of weeks ago. I don't really fully understand why. I just think that, like, slamming power just is good enough a lot of the time. I will tell you, I am generally down on Fenris stuff right now, in large part because I really hate playing Gladiator. And that's not just like an, oh, I'm so unlucky, Gladiator sells all my games. It's that there's a lot of people playing Nightmare, and he's just actively bad into that matchup. It's really, really bad. So you end up having to make up that difference. Luckily, you can, because you are a Cannonball Mercury deck, you are a Shang-Chi deck, you have these answers in your deck, you are able to do that. This is still a very strong list. I consider it sort of a backbone of the non-fully interactive mid-rangey style of decks. That is the other large sector of this metagame where it's like there are decks that sort of run the gamut. The ones we talked about at the beginning are fully interactive. They're all about their interaction, and they are trying to get their points as high as possible with as little investment as possible. Whereas decks like this are a little bit more proactive, a little bit more willing to just like present threats, but they still have Cannonball and Shang as those big erasers. Another deck that's similar is the Rabbit Sweet Ronin Supergiant. Unfortunately, I think this deck took a ton of damage from the prevalence of Nightmare because of just how reliant on Gladiator it can be for points. This is a reasonable deck, but I do think I prefer, if I'm going to be a Quicksilver gamer, to play the other one right now just because of how this metagame is set up. Let's talk about the combo side of the metagame, and I am going to start here because I consider it my job to give you an accurate metagame report. My thoughts on this deck are as follows. I had a very high win rate with it when I played it. There are multiple confounding factors. First, I am pretty good at decks like this. Second, I got very lucky, presumably, or I could have gotten very lucky and maybe not noticed it. Third, a lot of people, when I played this deck, were playing Nightmare decks, which basically fold to this entirely and have no way of actually engaging with it. Fourth, I was very early to Kid Omega, which maybe gave me a first mover advantage, and people aren't necessarily prepared to play against it, or weren't in a way they are maybe prepared to play against it now. All of that is to say, I think there are many reasons why this deck was my most successful climb of the season, and not all of them are related to the objective power of this list. I do think that it is a very strong list right now. I realize that that may be a controversial take, but I think it is more important that I give you accurate information than that I pretend this card doesn't exist. This is a good deck. I think that it does have pronounced weaknesses in ways that Hela did not. Red Guardian is very good. Juggernaut can be very good at disrupting late games. Surge doesn't belong in this deck, and I don't know what is supposed to be in there instead. What is scary is if this deck starts to get refined, because I personally have been avoiding playing Kid Omega for obvious reasons at this point. And I think that if people started really putting time into this, it could get to a sort of Hela level where it's just so big and so non-interactive that you just don't really know what the hell is actually supposed to happen in a game against it, or what you're supposed to be able to do about what they're doing. This is a deck that, when it does what it does and you can't interact with it meaningfully, just sort of wins. And we talked about how many of these decks are like Gwen Shang things. There's actually less Red Guardian and Juggernaut running around than there normally would be, and that is benefiting this deck. Do I think this deck is the new Hela? Not right now. Definitely doesn't have the play rate to be the new Hela, doesn't even really have the play rate to be worth teching against. But I am scared of it. If you want to play the ethical version of I would like to beat up all these mid-range decks, Move Bounce is absolutely that for you. And I can't believe I'm saying that. You guys know how I feel about Move Bounce. I'm out here calling Move Bounce ethical. But yeah, this is the ethical combo deck du jour right now, and I think you could argue it's even better because it is harder to interact with. Move Bounce has a very high ceiling, and it has a very great amount of ability to dodge interaction. When so many people are playing interactive decks, you'll notice only one of them had the Invisible Woman required to even begin to approach dealing with a deck like this. This will beat most of the Merlin Surge Zabu piles because they are counting on their interaction. You will have more stats than them, and their interaction will not be enough. That is a very valuable metagame position to occupy, and it's one that Move Bounce has occupied fairly consistently for a while now. Downside, it is fragile, and you can set yourself up for failure if you aren't aggressive enough or understanding your role as a combo deck enough. Mr. Negative will literally farm basically every single deck in the entire game that does not have access to a Mobius. Notably, if you want to try to specifically tech against Kid Omega, you can play the Null version of this, which is a popular choice, and I think if Kid Omega does become a large metagame force once his acquisition becomes 6,000 tokens instead of $10 million, this will be the kind of thing that you will tech against it to force it out of the metagame in much the same way as Mr. Negative forced Hela out of the metagame previously. Kid Omega decks are very dependent on killing stuff and bringing it back. Null Mystique crushes that entirely. I haven't made that change yet because I frankly just don't see that much Kid Omega. Good, I guess, but also, if that ever does happen, keep that change in the back of your mind, because it'll be really damn good. I think of Discard in much the same way as I think of Move Bounce, but Discard is a little more on board. And so while both of them are decks that can reasonably throw priority into final turn point explosions, a lot of what Discard gets its final turn point explosions out of can be interacted with, where a lot of what Move Bounce gets its final turn point explosions out of is just in your hand. And what I mean by that is, like, okay, let's say you have your Dakin thing going, they Winds of Watum your Dakin, and you cry. Or they Enchantress your Morbius, or Red Guardian your Collector, or Killmonger your Meek. There are no one-card solves for Discard, the way that there are for Mr. Negative in the form of Mobius, but there are a lot of different solves for Discard, and a lot of them will be relevant in much the same way that this was a Thanos victim. Discard could very easily be described as just a tech card victim generally, and given how we opened the video, I would prefer to play Move Bounce over Discard, given the current situation. We're in a metagame that is heavy enough on these tech decks that normal bounce can exist again, and I think that's a really cool space to be in. One of the things that normal bounce always had that was an awkward positioning for it was sometimes you'd be like doing your normal bounce thing, you'd make a bunch of guys, and then you'd realize that you just didn't have enough stats in a given lane. You just didn't have like the ability to go super tall a lot of the time. And that is still here. Like, you are still going to be vulnerable to that kind of stuff. There are still going to be some mid-range decks that can go drastically over the top of you. But honestly, outside of the ones that are playing like Invisible Woman Killmonger, I don't think you have a lot to worry about. Your baseline draw beats their baseline draw because you are dodging their interaction and you're outputting more points than them, or a similar amount of points to them. A lot of the points of these mid-range decks is wrapped up in their interaction, so if you can blank their interaction, you end up in a good spot. Downside, it's probably the smallest of the decks that does this. Upside, it's probably the most consistent. That's the real sort of trade-off here. Bounce is more consistent than Move Bounce. Bounce is more consistent than Discard. It will do its thing almost every game, but the ceiling is lower. And that means that when you end up in those mirrors, you don't have interaction for them. We've spent so much time talking about the heavily interactive mid-range decks that there are some that have been a little bit overlooked. This is my preferred build of Batroc, but honestly, I've also seen people succeeding with Scream, with like a Hellion in it, which is really cool. A lot of point distribution type stuff goes on there. I have preferred the hard tech mid-range decks, in large part because of what the metagame looks like right now, but if things soften up just a little bit, decks like this, and of course a Scream-style deck that has similar stuff in it, maybe with a Cannonball Mercury, who knows, that could be really damn good too. These mid-range decks are sort of anti-mid-range mid-range decks. What they're good at doing is beating out the heavy tech decks by not having a lot of stuff that's super vulnerable to the tech while scaling pretty high regardless. I think that means they're pretty well positioned right now, but because they don't have heavy tech, they don't have the problem solvers needed to deal with a combo deck. If you play against Kid Omega or Mr. Negative or whatever with this deck, you lose. If you play against Cerebro with this deck, you lose. I don't love C2 right now, but it is still a deck. I'm not going to sit here and be like, it's good. It's not good. We're in the destroy section of this tier list, right? Like, that's sort of what C2 is here. But it isn't that bad, and I do think that it's just a very reasonable thing to be doing. I know that Eggy has been playing C3, I know that C6 has been running around as a sort of answer to the super high ceiling stuff. I actually like the look of the C6 build, but I don't really tend to put untested stuff on here. I think there's a lot to be said for being a Cerebro gamer right now, and there's a lot to be, you know, it's the destroy section. You know what this is. I think the deck is okay, but I think it's at the low end of playability. If you're just a stats watcher, you probably look at Untapped and you see this deck doing well and you assume that it must be amazing in its own right. I personally disagree. I talked to Jet, the person who created this deck, this is his build, and I asked him straight up, hey, this is kind of like not as good anymore now that people aren't playing as much Monte. And he was just like, yup. And that is sort of where this deck is at. This was a very hard-targeted anti-Monte deck that was getting a lot of value from just absolutely obliterating those guys. I'm not going to sit here and act like it's absolutely terrible now, but a lot has shifted in the metagame that has made it a much worse choice. Now, you're nickel and diming out all of your games against people that actually have cards that do things. That's not really where this deck wants to be. It wants to be in 30 power Cassandra Nova land. That's where it wants to be. Last up, an honorable mention. I know Darkrazor has been pushing very high ranks with Fenris Surfer. I think this is a reasonably good metagame for Surfer type stuff right now. I actually think this is an even better metagame for Gambit type stuff right now. So I do like the direction this has taken the deck. I think it's very cool. I think it's very nice, especially like the part where we aren't gladiatoring anymore. I also like the surprise Shang-Chi because I'm me and I love my crutch, and that's what Shang is for me. However, I will give you a little bit of a warning. I've been watching some of Darkrazor's streams. One of my friends mentioned that they think that there might be some CL shenanigans going on with Darkrazor right now, so these stats are, at least in his mind, a little bit questionable. I haven't done a ton of research into whether they added any kind of CL protection to Infinite, but it is something that came up when I talked to other high-level players about this situation, and I don't necessarily know what that means in terms of am I able to recommend the deck, because I like it and he's doing really well with it, but I do want to see like some sort of distribution across a larger player base first, which is why it's an honorable mention. But yeah, absolutely think this is a really compelling direction for the list. Shout out to Darkrazor. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I really appreciate those of you that stick around, like, subscribe, and comment. I will see you in the next one, and I truly hope you have a wonderful day. You have been phenomenal. I think I already said it, but I just want to make sure. I'll see you later.